Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
America must put its own citizens first, because only then can we truly make America great again.
In his first address to a joint session of Congress, President Trump vowed to greatly expand the military budget, end Obamacare, and restrict immigration in the name of national security.
We cannot allow a beachhead of terrorism to form inside America. We cannot allow our nation to become a sanctuary for extremists.
Trump also repeated his call for a wall on the southern border and to create a government registry of crimes committed by undocumented immigrants.
I have ordered the Department of Homeland Security to create an office to serve American victims. The office is called VOICE, Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement.
We'll get response from around the country. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In his first address to a joint session of Congress, President Donald Trump vowed to expand the United States military budget, end the Affordable Care Act, and sharply restrict immigration into the United States. The Washington Post reports the 60-minute speech included multiple factual inaccuracies, which include Trump taking credit for jobs that were actually created under the previous administration and misrepresenting statistics to make unemployment and crime rates appear significantly worse than they are. Trump also repeated his claim that he's draining the swamp of government corruption, a statement that caused some Democratic lawmakers to laugh, given Trump's cabinet largely consists of millionaires and billionaires with unprecedented conflicts of interest. Many Democratic congresswomen wore white to Trump's speech to honor the women's suffragist movement. Throughout the address, Trump reiterated his campaign's extreme nationalistic vision for the country, although he sought to soften his tone and delivery. Trump opened his speech by condemning attacks against Jews and the murder of an Indian man in Kansas last week.
Recent threats targeting Jewish community centers and vandalism of Jewish cemeteries, as well as last week's shooting in Kansas City, remind us that while we may be a nation divided on policies, we are a country that stands united in condemning hate and evil in all of its very ugly forms. That's
President Trump speaking last night to Congress, condemning the 5 nationwide waves of bomb threats targeting Jewish community centers, the desecration of hundreds of grave sites at 2 Jewish cemeteries, and the murder of an Indian man in Kansas by a white man who reportedly yelled, "Get out of my country," before opening fire. Trump's been under enormous pressure to condemn the threats and attacks, but just earlier in the day, President Trump reportedly made a strange comment about the anti-Semitic threats during a meeting with state attorneys general, in which Trump appeared to question whether the Jewish community itself was behind the bomb threats. Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro says Trump said of threats, quote, "Sometimes it's the reverse, to make people or to make others look bad," unquote. Shapiro said Trump went on to use the word reverse 2 or 3 more times. In response, Stephen Goldstein of the Anne Frank Center said, quote, "Mr. President, have you no decency? To cast doubt on the authenticity of an anti-Semitic hate crimes in America constitutes anti-Semitism in itself, and that's something none of us ever dreamed would disgrace our nation from the White House," unquote. During President Trump's speech to the joint session of Congress last night, he announced plans to create a new office called VOICE. That's Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement. Trump has previously directed the Homeland Security Department to publish a list of crimes committed by immigrants, which some historians have compared to Germany's Nazi-era policy of publishing lists of crimes committed by Jews. Trump invited family members of people killed by undocumented immigrants to his speech last night. Democrats, meanwhile, gave their tickets away to immigrants, including 16-year-old Angel Reyes Garcia and 14-year-old Jacqueline Reyes Garcia, whose mother, Guadalupe, was deported back to Mexico earlier this year after she went to a routine ICE check-in. During Trump's speech, he reiterated his campaign promises to crack down on immigration and immigrants living in the United States.
My administration has answered the pleas of the American people for immigration enforcement and border security. By finally enforcing our immigration laws, we will raise wages, help the unemployed, save billions and billions of dollars, and make our communities safer for everyone.
But only hours earlier, Trump reportedly suggested during a meeting with TV anchors at the White House that he might be open to a form of immigration bill that would grant legal status to millions of undocumented immigrants. We'll have more on Trump's speech and immigration policies later in the broadcast. During Trump's speech to Congress last night, he also honored Navy SEAL Ryan Owens, who was killed in a botched raid on a Yemeni village that also left 25 civilians dead, including 9 children under the age of 13. Last night, Trump referred to the raid as being highly successful. At the speech, Owens' widow, Karen Owens, fought back tears as Trump called her late husband a warrior and a hero. However, in a taped interview with Fox and Friends that aired earlier in the day Tuesday, Trump blamed Owens' death on the generals.
This was something that was, just they wanted to do. They came to see me. They explained what they wanted to do, the generals, who are very respected. My generals are the most respected that we've had in many decades, I believe. And they lost Ryan.
Owens' father, Bill Owens, refused to meet with President Trump at Dover Air Force Base and has called for an investigation into his son's death. Speaking to the Miami Herald, Bill Owens said his conscience wouldn't let him meet with Trump, and it said, quote, "Why at this time did there have to be this stupid mission when it wasn't even barely a week into his administration," unquote. President Trump's expected to sign a new executive order in the coming days limiting or barring entry into the United States by refugees or residents of some majority Muslim nations. His first executive order banning people from Iraq, Syria, Iran, Sudan, Libya, Somalia, and Yemen from entering the U.S. was blocked by the courts last month. According to the Associated Press, Trump's new order will not ban Iraqi citizens from traveling to the United States. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos is facing backlash and ridicule after she claimed that historically black colleges and universities are an example of school choice, following a listening session at the White House Monday with the presidents and chancellors of these historically black colleges and universities, often known as HBCUs. In a statement, she wrote, quote, "HBCUs are real pioneers when it comes to school choice. They're living proof that when more options are provided to students, they're afforded greater access and greater quality," unquote. On Twitter, many ridiculed DeVos's comments, saying they displayed a lack of historical context. HBCUs were established because black students were prohibited from attending public colleges and universities throughout much of U.S. history. One Twitter user wrote, "Betsy DeVos said HBCUs were about school choice, as if white-colored water fountains were about beverage options," unquote. Another user joked that it was as if DeVos had said, quote, "Rosa Parks is a real pioneer when it comes to seat choice," unquote. The backlash against DeVos's comments come as White House counselor Kellyanne Conway has responded to criticism over a series of photos showing her kneeling on a couch in the Oval Office with her shoes on in the middle of President Trump's listening session with the presidents and chancellors of the HBCUs. In her response, Kellyanne Conway repeatedly used the wrong acronym to refer to the HBCUs.
Take a certain angle and was doing exactly that. I certainly meant no disrespect. I didn't mean to have my feet on the couch. I just want people to focus on the great work of the HBCU presidents.
In India, crowds of people protested against President Trump at the funeral of 32-year-old Srinivas Kochibatla, an aviation engineer who was shot and killed by a white man in Kansas last week. Navy veteran Adam Purinton reportedly yelled, "Get out of my country," before opening fire on Kochibatla and his friend who was wounded. Purinton apparently thought the 2 Indian men were Iranian. At the funeral in the southern Indian city of Hyderabad, mourners chanted, "Down with Trump," and held up signs reading, "Down with racism." In Colombia, the Constitutional Court has ruled in favor of the miners and residents of the town of Marmato, who have been fighting an open-pit gold mine for 10 years. In its ruling Tuesday, the judges said the town's Afro-Colombian and indigenous residents who've been fighting the massive project have the right to be consulted about whether the Canadian-based Gran Colombia Gold Corporation can continue parts of construction. In Louisiana, news has surfaced that black transgender teenager Jacarius Holland was murdered last month, making her at least the third transgender woman to be killed in the state of Louisiana in February. Holland was 18 years old. She was initially misgendered in local news reports about her killing on February 19th. She's at least the seventh transgender woman to be murdered in 2017. Uber CEO Travis Kalanick is under fire after Bloomberg News published a dash cam video of him arguing with and insulting an Uber driver in an expletive-filled tirade. This is driver Fauzi Kamel confronting Kalanick about his decision to lower the prices for rides for the company's high-end service, Uber Black.
I lost $97,000 because of you. I bankrupt because of you.
Look.
Yes.
You know what?
You keep changing every day.
You
keep changing
hold on a
every
second.
day.
What have I changed about Black?
Huh?
What have
you
I
changed
changed?
the whole business.
What?
You dropped the prices.
On Black.
Yes, you did. Did with $20. Started with $20.
You know what?
How much is the mile now? $2.75?
You know what?
What?
Some people don't like to take responsibility for their... They blame everything in their life on somebody else.
But why you sending an email for town card?
Good luck.
Good luck to you, too.
After the video surfaced, CEO Travis Kalanick said, quote, "To say that I'm ashamed is an extreme understatement," unquote. Uber's also embroiled in a controversy over allegations of sexual harassment. On Monday, the head of the engineering department was fired after it emerged he'd failed to disclose he'd left his previous job at Google amid sexual harassment accusations. His departure comes a week after a former Uber engineer said she endured sexual harassment on the job and that Uber's HR department had refused to take action. And today is the legendary singer, actor, and activist Harry Belafonte's 90th birthday. For decades, Harry Belafonte has been a leading voice for civil rights. He was one of Martin Luther King's closest confidants and helped organize the March on Washington in 1963. More recently, he was an honorary co-chair of the Women's March on Washington, the largest protest after a president's inauguration in U.S. history. In December, Harry Belafonte joined Democracy Now! For our 20th anniversary celebration in the historic Riverside Church here in Manhattan.
A group of young black students in Harlem just a few days ago asked me what at this point in my life was I looking for. And I said, what I've always been looking for. Where resides the rebel heart? Without the rebellious heart, without people who understand that there's no sacrifice we can make that is too great to retrieve that which we've lost. We will forever be distracted with possessions and trinkets and title.
Again, Harry Belafonte turns 90 years old today. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In his first speech to a joint session of Congress, President Donald Trump vowed to greatly expand the Pentagon's budget, repeal and replace Obamacare, build a wall along the southern border with Mexico, and crack down on undocumented immigrants in the name of national security. The Washington Post reports the 60-minute speech included multiple factual inaccuracies, which include Trump taking credit for jobs that were actually created under the previous administration, and misrepresenting statistics to make unemployment and crime rates appear significantly worse than they are. While the tone was softer than his inaugural address, Trump focused on his extreme nationalistic vision for the country.
America must put its own citizens first, because only then can we truly make America great again.
During his speech, which he closely read from a teleprompter, Trump repeatedly called for curtailing immigration for economic and security reasons.
Our obligation is to serve, protect, and defend the citizens of the United States. We are also taking strong measures to protect our nation from radical Islamic terrorism. According to data provided by the Department of Justice, the vast majority of individuals convicted of terrorism and terrorism-related offenses since 9/11 came here from outside of our country. We have seen the attacks at home, from Boston to San Bernardino to the Pentagon, and yes, even the World Trade Center. We have seen the attacks in France, in Belgium, in Germany, and all over the world. It is not compassionate, but reckless to allow uncontrolled entry from places where proper vetting cannot occur. Those given the high honor of admission to the United States should support this country and love its people and its values. We cannot allow a beachhead of terrorism to form inside America. We cannot allow our nation to become a sanctuary for extremists. That is why my administration has been working on improved vetting procedures, and we will shortly take new steps to keep our nation safe and to keep those out who will do us harm.
While he gave no details, Trump is expected to sign a new executive order in the coming days limiting or barring entry into the United States by refugees or residents of some majority Muslim nations. His first executive order banned people from Iraq, Syria, Iran, Sudan, Libya, Somalia, and Yemen from entering the U.S., but it was blocked by the courts last month. According to the Associated Press, Trump's new order will not ban Iraqi citizens from traveling to the United States. The new order will also reportedly exclude legal permanent residents and existing visa holders. To talk more about Trump's speech to Congress in his first 40 days in office, we'll be joined by a number of guests. Jeffrey Sachs, leading economist, director of sustainable development at Columbia University. William Hartung is the director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy. Linda Sarsour is a leading Muslim American organizer, served as co-chair of the Women's March on Washington. Kelly Lytle Hernandez will be joining us, associate professor in the UCLA Department of History. And soon, Ola Ajuumi will be with us, community organizer, founder of Project Ascend. She was at the event last night. She was at the hearing. She was at the speech of President Trump, his first address to a joint session of Congress. I want to begin with Linda Sarsour, your response to what President Trump said last night.
I'm still mind-boggled by people who are saying he sounded presidential. I guess reading and being able to follow a teleprompter is the bar we've set to what it means to be presidential. It was outrageous how he used very tragic events of people who lost their loved ones to sow fear against immigrants and undocumented people. He talked about all these things, military expansion, about the wall, but never told anyone, and infrastructure, but never told us how we were going to pay for it. He took a lot of credit for things that happened under the previous administration when it came to job growth in this country. There was so much inaccuracy, and I actually dared people on Twitter to, I made a bet, how long would it take for him to talk about radical Islamic terrorism, and it didn't take quite long for him to talk about radical Islamic terrorism in his speech. And again, just really overall, just really outrageous. And I was actually invited to attend the joint address. I was invited by Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, but I just couldn't bring myself to come into that space and legitimize a man who I believe is not my president.
Jeffrey Sachs, your response to what President Trump said last night.
Well, it doesn't make sense and it doesn't add up. He has a theory, if you could dignify it that way, which is that America somehow is being cheated by the rest of the world, and he's going to help people who are hurting by getting back at the rest of the world, whether it's the Mexicans, Muslims, Chinese, and so on. And unfortunately, like many bad theories, and Ronald Reagan had a bad theory to destroy government to solve such problems, Trump has the wrong theory, and it can't work because our problems are not the ones that he's pointing his finger at. He has no way to pay for what he says. The only proposal to pay for what he says is, quote unquote, is tax cuts, which obviously expands deficits. This is an anti-young people's administration also. He is out to destroy the environment. He's out to increase the public debt massively. It's young people that will pay the costs of all of this. Maybe it's not surprising for a man who lives in the past, thinks in the past, has no vision of the future. Ironically, he tried a Kennedy-esque twist. He talked about the torch being passed, but when he became president, the torch was passed back to the 20th century, definitely not forward to the 21st century.
We're going to go to break, and then when we come back, we'll get response from Bill Hartung on the massive increase in the military budget that President Trump is calling for and spoke about last night. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.
Boy, don't touch me like you're going crazy. Let go me hand, let me jump up in the band. I don't want nobody to come and stop me. Leave me, let me free up. Myself, let me jump up. So leave me alone. I am going home. So leave me alone. I am going home. Let me party, let me party, let me party, let me party.
If we let we party, we having a ball. Nobody can stop we. No, not at all, I'm not chanting. Ay, ay, ay. When you see me, and the music hit me, ay, ay, ay. I just break me, getting on bad with somebody. So when you see me in the line, no matter what the time, I ready for the pumping. From back in the day till I hold and I pray, I prepared for the jumping. If you're 15 or 25, if you're 50 or 75, once you're breathing and you are alive, so we whining all day.
Leave Me Alone by Calypso Rose, featuring Manu Chao here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Speaking Tuesday evening before a joint session of Congress, President Donald Trump called for a historic increase in military spending.
Finally, to keep America safe, we must provide the men and women of the United States military with the tools they need to prevent war. If they must, they have to fight, and they only have to win. I am sending Congress a budget that rebuilds the military, eliminates the defense sequester, and calls for one of the largest increases in national defense spending in American history.
That was President Trump last night. Bill Hartung, your director of Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy. Your response?
Well, he committed truth. He said it's one of the largest military budget increases in history, about 10%. $54 billion, which, to put it in perspective, would be about what the United Kingdom spends, just the increase. That would be the 7th biggest military budget in the world. And, of course, we're spending at historic levels, $600 billion a year, which is more than the peak of Reagan. The Obama years, we spent more than under George W. Bush. So the idea that there's a gap in military spending is ludicrous. He hasn't talked about tens of billions of dollars in Pentagon waste. And, of course, he hasn't said how he's going to use the military other than rattling sabers about Iran. Which were they to go to war with Iran, as one person said, would be make Iraq look like a walk in the park. So I think the money is problematic, but also kind of the reckless possibilities of how they might use the military. And given the people around him, Steve Bannon, but also these generals who are supposed to be the adults in the room, are probably the most hawkish generals in some ways of their generation. McMaster helped with the surge. Mattis wanted to attack Iran in the middle of the Iraq War, which is why he left the Obama team. So the idea that these are the sober voices that are going to restrain things, I think, is to some degree wishful thinking.
Jeffrey Sachs.
I was just going to add that the $600 billion that we spend is only counting a part of what we really spend on the military. We have another $60 billion in addition to the $600 billion of the Pentagon that is the intelligence agencies. We have Homeland Security. We have military expenses hidden in the Department of Energy. Of course, we have the incredible costs, human damage and health in the Veterans Administration. If you add it all up, it's probably closer to $900 billion a year. It completely swamps everything else that we're doing right now, and now he's going to add on top of that and propose tax cuts for rich people and for corporations. So this is just one illusion after another, and it's got to come to a bad end in some way.
During his speech on Tuesday night, President Trump suggested the United States should transition to a merit-based immigration system.
The current outdated system depresses wages for our poorest workers and puts great pressure on taxpayers. Nations around the world, like Canada, Australia, and many others, have a merit-based immigration system. It's a basic principle that those seeking to enter a country ought to be able to support themselves financially. Yet in America, we do not enforce this rule, straining the very public resources that our poorest citizens rely upon. According to the National Academy of Sciences, our current immigration system costs American taxpayers many billions of dollars a year. Switching away from this current system of lower-skilled immigration and instead adopting a merit-based system, we will have so many more benefits. It will save countless dollars, raise workers' wages, and help struggling families, including immigrant families, enter the middle class. And they will do it quickly, and they will be very, very happy indeed.
That was Donald Trump before that joint session of Congress last night. Kelly Lytle Hernandez is with us, associate professor at the UCLA Department of History, author of Migra, A History of the U.S. Border Patrol. Your response to his address, and specifically what he said about immigration, Professor?
Well, in terms of a merit-based immigration system, it really highlights the fact that I don't think he really understands the immigration system we currently have in place. It largely is a skill-based system and a family reunification system. Skill-based in the sense that we're fulfilling needs in the labor market here. So once again, I'm concerned that we have a president who is issuing policy or making statements without fully understanding the system in which we're working.
Let me play another clip of President Trump last night, where he reiterated his plans to crack down on undocumented immigrants and build a wall along the southern border.
At the same time, my administration has answered the pleas of the American people for immigration enforcement and border security. By finally enforcing our immigration laws, we will raise wages, help the unemployed, save billions and billions of dollars, and make our communities safer for everyone. We want all Americans to succeed, but that can't happen in an environment of lawless chaos. We must restore integrity and the rule of law at our borders. For that reason, we will soon begin the construction of a great, great wall along our southern border.
Professor Kelly Lytle Hernandez, talk about this. This is your focus, your specialty.
Absolutely. Well, he has promised us a great, great, beautiful wall along the U.S.-Mexico border, and he's promised us that the Mexican government is going to pay for it. Now, historically speaking, this is one of the most interesting parts of the Trump administration, that for the last 100 years, more or less, Mexico and the United States have worked collaboratively on controlling migration across the U.S.-Mexico border. But it's on this point that the Mexican government has really dug in its heels and said, we will not assist in building this wall, and we will not assist in the mass deportations planned from the United States to Mexico. In fact, the Mexican government is providing legal services for Mexican residents living within the United States should they be apprehended by the U.S. Border Patrol or by ICE. Now, what's really interesting about this is the last time I am aware of the Mexican government really opposing cooperating with the United States on immigration control along the border is back in the 19th century, and that had to do with slavery. During the times of slavery in the United States, U.S. slaveholders would put pressure on the Mexican government to return slaves who ran away and found freedom and liberty in Mexico. And the Mexican government refused to do so. So we've gone more than 100 years since we've had this kind of opposition from the Mexican government on this issue of collaborating over migration control.
What is your sense of how many people have been rounded up since President Trump came into office, since the ban, which has been stopped by the courts, but because he couldn't enforce what he's even called the Muslim ban, this crackdown on immigrants in this country, particularly Latino immigrants, and sending them over the border?
Well, the crackdown hasn't come yet. So far, we have a lot of rhetoric, and we have a lot of scare tactics, but Trump really doesn't have the funding, he doesn't have the cooperation at the local level to really fulfill his promised crackdown. Now, this is really interesting because he did promise us a resurrection of Operation Wetback of 1954, which is usually cited as the largest mass deportation campaign in U.S. history. But the fact is that not that many deportations happened during 1954, at maximum about 300,000, not the 1 million that are usually cited. And what really did happen during that summer was a scare campaign, and that the U.S. Border Patrol and the Immigration and Naturalization Service led a campaign, issued statements promising to round up, detain in large numbers, and deport up to 1 million Mexican immigrants. And it was that campaign that frightened many people into self-deporting. I think that this is really the stage that we're seeing Trump resurrect right now, is the scare tactics. Whether or not he actually gets the funding from Congress to turn this into a real immigration law enforcement campaign, that remains to be seen.
I guess in the first week after the ban was rejected, something like, 700 people were rounded up in raids from Los Angeles to Arizona to other places.
Absolutely. I'm not saying that the raids are not happening. I'm saying they're not happening at the scale of mass deportation that would lead us to 5, 6, 7 million deportations.
Well, President Trump opened his speech last night by condemning bomb threats against Jewish community centers and the murder of an Indian man in Kansas last week in an apparent hate crime.
Recent threats targeting Jewish community centers and vandalism of Jewish cemeteries, as well as last week's shooting in Kansas City, remind us that while we may be a nation divided on policies, we are a country that stands united in condemning hate and evil in all of its very ugly forms.
So that's President Trump condemning the 5 nationwide waves of bomb threats targeting Jewish community centers, desecration of hundreds of grave sites at 2 Jewish cemeteries, and the murder of an Indian man in Kansas by a white man who reportedly yelled, "Get out of my country," before opening fire. He apparently thought that the men were Iranian. Trump has been under enormous pressure to condemn the threats and attacks. But just earlier in the day, President Trump reportedly made a strange comment about the anti-Semitic threats during a meeting with state attorneys general, in which he appeared to question whether the Jewish community itself was behind the bomb threats. Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro says Trump said of the threats, quote, "Sometimes it's the reverse, to make people or to make others look bad," unquote. Pennsylvania Attorney General Shapiro said Trump went on to use used the word reverse 2 or 3 more times. In response, Stephen Goldstein of the Anne Frank Center said, quote, "Mr. President, have you no decency to cast doubt on the authenticity of anti-Semitic hate crimes in America? Constitutes anti-Semitism in itself, and that's something none of us ever dreamed would disgrace our nation from the White House," unquote. Linda Sarsour, when the attack on the Missouri Jewish cemetery took place, the toppling of the scores of tombstones, you immediately went online to raise money for the cemetery. Can you tell us what you did?
I was just horrified that that people or someone can desecrate a cemetery where there have been people buried there since the 1800s. I mean, these are people trying to rest in peace, and their families live across the country. And as a Muslim, I was very moved, and I joined a colleague of mine in Philadelphia, Tariq al-Masidi, and we started a campaign. And we said we're going to give, you know, a symbol just of solidarity, $20,000. And within 3 hours, we had already raised $20,000. We have raised over $125,000, and we are actually going to be sharing those resources with the Philadelphia cemetery that Tariq actually just visited. I'm just, for me, it's the words of Donald Trump at his joint address was a little too late for me. There have been dozens of bomb threats across the country against Jewish centers, the 2 cemeteries, the Indian Man. There have been 4 mosques that have been victims to arson just in the past 6 weeks, and he has said nothing and waited to come to that address and ignore the Islamophobic attacks and arsons that have happened against the Muslim community and Muslim centers.
The center in Texas, the mosque that was burned to the ground, and the Jewish synagogue handing their keys to the Muslim worshippers to say, our house is your house. We've seen this kind of just grassroots solidarity. You raised that amount of money without, though obviously Donald Trump is a notorious tweeter. He didn't tweet on any of these attacks.
It's just, you know, somebody asked me, they said, you know, how could Donald Trump, you know, what does he have to do? What actions does he take to stand up against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia? And I said he can start with removing the Islamophobes and the anti-Semites in the White House. We have an administration that has the most notorious anti-Semites, the most notorious white supremacists and Islamophobes that is creating this environment. And I do put blame on this administration for the attacks and the rhetoric that is happening against our communities.
Bill Hartung, your thoughts on this?
Well, I think it's interesting. He's got a special unit to deal with crimes by immigrants who commit crimes at a lower level than pretty much any other group in America. Where is the unit to deal with gun violence? Where is the unit to deal with police violence? Where is the unit to deal with Islamophobia? Where is the unit to deal with anti-Semitism? They don't exist. The fact that he can read one line off a script proves nothing. He would have to go a long, long way before I would believe that he's changed his tune on this. And as Linda said, he should start by getting rid of the people around him who have documented records of hate.
Let's go to Donald Trump calling for this new government agency for victims of crime by immigrants.
And we must support the victims of crime. I have ordered the Department of Homeland Security to create an office to serve American victims. The office is called VOICE, Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement. We are providing a voice to those who have been ignored by our media and silenced by special interests.
Professor Kelly Lytle Hernandez, your comments on this, the idea that President Trump has repeatedly trumpeted that immigrants commit more crimes.
Well, that's factually untrue. We have research out of the Pew Research Center and out of the track researchers from Syracuse University and many others who have repeatedly documented that immigrants have a lower crime rate than native-born U.S. citizens. So that is just factually untrue. What's really happening here is a demonization campaign and a criminalization campaign, trying to lift up and put a spotlight on a small number of tragic crimes impacting U.S. citizens, meaning usually he's talking about the killing of U.S. citizens by undocumented immigrants. And he's highlighting it in a way to demonize an entire population, immigrant population, namely Muslim and Latino immigrants. I would suspect to shore up his broader policies on immigration restriction. So this is a historically familiar act, that these kinds of criminalization campaigns have always preceded immigrant exclusion. We can go back to the Chinese Exclusion Acts, where folks in the American West in particular demonized Chinese immigrants as opium dealers, and then that led to support for the Chinese Exclusion Acts and mass deportation of Chinese immigrants. We can also go back to the early 20th century when Italian immigrants were demonized as being biologically criminal and inferior, leading to the Immigration Control Act, or the National Origins Act of 1924, which largely prohibited Italian immigrants from entering the United States. So this is historically consistent.
And scholars also say Trump's proposed list of crimes committed by immigrants recalls Nazi Germany-era policy, where the Nazi Institute for Research on the Jewish question kept files on crimes committed by Jews. We recently spoke to Andrea Pitzer. Her upcoming book is called One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps.
This weekly report that he has called for recalls a number of things from the past that we have seen before, which is this move to isolate and identify and then vilify a vulnerable minority community in order to move against it. I just went back last night and reread his speech from when he declared his candidacy, and the Mexican rapist comment was in from the beginning. And so this has been a theme throughout. And we see back in Nazi Germany, there was a Nazi paper called Der Stürmer, and they had a department called Letterbox. And readers were invited to send in stories of supposed Jewish crimes. And Der Stürmer would publish them, and they would include some pretty horrific graphic illustrations of these crimes as well. And there was even a sort of a light version of it, if you will, racism light, in which the Neues Volk, which was more like a Look or a Life magazine, which normally highlighted beautiful Aryan families and their beautiful homes, would run a feature like The Criminal Jew, and they would show photos of Jewish-looking, as they called it, people who represented different kinds of crimes that one ought to watch out for from Jews. So this preoccupation with focusing in on one subset of the population's crimes and then depicting that as somehow depraved and abnormal from the main population is something we've seen quite a bit in the past.
So that's Andrea Pitzer, her upcoming book, One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. Again, we're talking about President Trump announcing he has set up the Voice office, Voice standing for Victims of Immigrant Crime Engagement. Professor Sachs.
I thought what was interesting was there was a loud groan when he said that throughout the chamber, not an applause, nothing, because that one is so absurd, so transparently phony, that while the Republicans were jumping up and down at every bit of nonsense, that was nonsense too far.
We're going to break and then come back. We want to talk about the Affordable Care Act, and also what got the most sustained applause was the widow of the Navy SEAL who was killed in Yemen. President Trump called it highly successful raid. Many others have called it a botched catastrophe, including the victim's father. We're talking to Jeffrey Sachs, Linda Sarsour, William Hartung, Kelly Lytle-Hernandez, and we'll be joined by someone who was in the chamber last night in a moment.
No, no, no. You don't love me, and I know now. No, no, no. No, no, no.
Dawn Penn, you don't love me. No, no, no. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. During his speech before the joint session of Congress Tuesday night, President Trump called on Congress to address the, quote, imploding Obamacare disaster.
Tonight, I am also calling on this Congress to repeal and replace Obamacare. With reforms that expand choice, increase access, lower costs, and at the same time provide better health care. Mandating every American to buy government-approved health insurance was never the right solution for our country.
We're joined right now by Ola Ojewumi, who is a community organizer and founder of Project Ascend, which provides opportunities to local income and disabled students, to lower-income students. She attended the joint session of Congress last night as a guest of Maryland Congressman Steny Hoyer, as someone who was affected deeply by the Affordable Care Act. Can you respond to what President Trump said last night, what it was like to be in the room, and your thoughts?
It was wonderful to be in the room, but it was quite scary when I heard his comments about the Affordable Care Act. I personally was affected. I am the survivor of a heart and kidney transplant, and I was able to receive insurance and stay on my parents' insurance until I was 26, and I received cancer treatment and became a cancer survivor this year. So the action of repealing the Affordable Care Act would affect millions of Americans. There are 20 million people on the Affordable Care Act, and 49% of Americans approve of the Affordable Care Act. And the plan to repeal and replace would mean higher costs for health insurance and lower benefits for health insurance recipients. And I am terrified of what a repeal for the Affordable Care Act will do for people like me, disabled Americans like me. I'm sitting in a wheelchair now, but disabled people, Americans, are the largest minority in the United States, and we are not protected. And I needed the protection of the ACA, and I'm grateful to President Obama for his work on that and Congressman Hoyer's work as well.
Something that President Trump didn't mention last night was Planned Parenthood, but it's clearly at the target end of Republican policy right now. You know, the new head of, among other examples, of the Department of Health and Human Services, Pence, is one of the leaders to defund Planned Parenthood. Your thoughts on this, Ola?
Planned Parenthood has made an astounding impact. I've worked with Planned Parenthood Metro Washington's Developing Leaders program, and I've distributed condoms with them at local gay pride parades for the past 5 years. A plan to defund Planned Parenthood would harm women's reproductive health in the United States. It was quite a contradiction to hear President Trump advocate for women's health rights, but in the same breath before defunding Planned Parenthood, which isn't just a means for a woman to have an abortion, but it provides health screenings, mammograms, and provides a lot of care that poor and low-income women, specifically women of color like me in the Washington, D.C. area, with care that they could not otherwise get. And it would be a sad day in America for us to see more limited options for women's health care at a time where Planned Parenthood is villainized and defunded by the government, when to help women's health would be to fund Planned Parenthood and support it.
I wanted to turn to what President Trump said about health care on Monday when he spoke before a room full of state governors.
Now, I have to tell you, it's an unbelievably complex subject. Nobody knew that health care could be so complicated.
Professor Jeffrey Sachs, unbelievably complicated, he said. Something that isn't unbelievably complicated is Medicare for All. This is something that, that Bernie Sanders has talked about a great deal. In fact, I wanted to turn to what Bernie Sanders' response was to last night's, you can't call it a State of the Union address, but that's the speech that President Trump gave before a joint session of Congress.
I urge President Trump, keep your promises tell the American people, tweet to the American people that you will not cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Further, I did not hear President Trump tonight mention the words income and wealth inequality, or the fact that we now have the widest gap between the very rich and everyone else since the 1920s. I did not hear President Trump mention the fact that as a result of the disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision, a 5-4 decision, we now have a corrupt campaign finance system that is allowing billionaires to buy elections and undermine American democracy. How could you give a speech to the nation and not talk about that enormously important issue? Furthermore, not only did President Trump not mention the issue of voter suppression, what Republican governors are doing all over this country to make it harder for people to participate in our democracy, but the truth of the matter is his administration is now working overtime with Republican governors to make it harder for young people, low-income people, senior citizens, and people of color to vote. That is an outrage. Perhaps most astoundingly, at a time when the scientific community is virtually unanimous in telling us that climate change is real, that it is caused by human activity, that it is already causing devastating problems in our country and all over the world, I did not hear President Trump say one word, not one word, about the need to combat climate change, the greatest environmental threat facing our planet.
That's Bernie Sanders' response online last night to President Trump's address. You were the foreign policy advisor for Bernie Sanders. Professor Jeffrey Saxon, you're head of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia. But we started on the issue of health care and the issue that certainly Sanders has put forward, which is Medicare for all. What about what's happening to the ACA and or maybe what isn't, because it's clear they're having a great deal of trouble. Everywhere Republicans go, they're being faced by massive protest, and a lot of that is centered around don't take away my health care.
This is true of every part of Trump's agenda, which is that it's not thought out, and on the health side, they don't have an alternative plan. And people do not want to lose their access to health care, and the governors in Republican states as well are saying you cannot take these people off the rolls. So they're stuck. They do not have a plan. What is interesting, I think there's one thing that we should also mention. Donald Trump rightly said we need to get drug prices down. This is something where both sides could agree we have incredible abuse by the pharmaceutical industry. We have medicines like sofosbuvir, which is for hepatitis C, that Gilead charges 1,000 times its production cost. This is an incredible abuse of the American people, and I think we should take up the president on that and say, okay, let's get these drug prices under control. They're hideous, and they're a big reason why our health system is so expensive.
I want to go to foreign policy. During Trump's speech to Congress, he also honored Navy SEAL Ryan Owens, who was killed in a botched raid on a Yemeni village that also left 25 civilians dead, including 9 children under the age of 13. Last night, Trump referred to the raid as being highly successful.
I just spoke to our great General Mattis just now, who reconfirmed that, and I quote, Ryan was a part of a highly successful raid that generated large amounts of vital intelligence that will lead to many more victories in the future against our enemy. Ryan's legacy is etched into eternity. Thank you.
By far the longest standing ovation of the night. It may have been the longest standing ovation of any joint session of Congress event. A standing ovation for Ryan Owens' widow, Karen Owens, who fought back tears, looked to the heavens. Trump then went off script and addressed her directly.
And Ryan is looking down right now. You know that. And he's very happy because I think he just broke a record.
However, in a taped interview with Fox and Friends that aired earlier in the day, Trump blamed Owens' death on the generals. So Owen's father, Bill Owens, refused to meet with President Trump at Dover Air Force Base when both President Trump and the Owens family came to greet the body of Ryan. His father has called for an investigation into his son's death. Speaking to the Miami Herald, Bill Owens said his conscience wouldn't let him meet with Trump, and it said, quote, "Why at this time did there have to be this stupid mission when it wasn't even barely a week into his administration?" Professor Sachs, what about what took place, the attacks by Sean Spicer and President Trump around anyone who dared to question the raid? I believe Sean Spicer said at one of his press briefings, anyone who questions this has to answer to Owen's family, has to apologize to Owen's family.
Remember what the U.S. national security state says on almost any occasion is filled with lies. Let's know what this raid was about, how many children were killed, why are we fighting on the ground in Yemen in the first place, who approved that, what is all of this about? None of that is said. This is the sheerest foolishness, what happened last night. Of course, you can get people to stand and cheer. It's sad to see a widow, but for foreign policy terms, this is blatant lies, complete hiding of what's really going on throughout the Middle East, where the U.S. is fighting covert wars all over the place. And within the first week of office, Trump added this raid, which apparently killed a large number of children and women.
And apparently President Obama had not signed off on for something like 2 years, although under President Obama, the drone strikes in Yemen and other places have been unprecedented.
Yes. The truth is, whoever is president, that's where the buck stops. And when John Kennedy did the disastrous Bay of Pigs that was held over from the Eisenhower administration, he said, I take full responsibility for it. Trump never takes responsibility for anything.
It's either Obama or the general.
That's a psychological fact with him, which he seems incapable of taking responsibility.
Even before Bill Owens' son was killed, before Ryan was killed, he was infuriated by Trump, according to his interview in the Miami Herald, by Trump's attack on a Gold Star family, on Khizr Khan. Linda, as we come to the end of this hour, you're a major organizer, not only in New York, but around the country, one of the organizers of the March on Washington. What are the plans today? As I don't know if it's because so many of the leading anchors on the networks got to have a private, off-the-record conversation with President Trump yesterday, but there is a great softening toward, oh, this is the day he has become president. This is Donald Trump adopting a very important new tone. How does that affect your organizing?
Oh, I was fired up, and we were all more fired up after hearing his joint address yesterday, literally targeting every single issue that we care about, in particular as progressives. We will continue to organize. You have seen consistent organizing since the Women's March on Washington in every corner of this country. We're gearing up for a day without a woman, showing the president, who has continued to target us as women on many issues that we care about, but in particular on reproductive rights, that we are going to show him what happens when we keep our money in our pockets.
And that's what day?
That's going to be on International Women's Day on March 8th. And, you know, we as the American people got to start demanding transparency, early warning signs of fascism, and he's engaging in almost everything on that list that I saw at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. So stay alert. Reading a teleprompter is not what makes you presidential. It's your actions that you take, and it's democracy.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank you all for being with us. Linda Sarsour, thank you for joining us, leading activist here in New York. Jeffrey Sachs, professor at Columbia University, head of the Center for Sustainable Development, author of the new book, Building the New American Economy, Smart, Fair, and Sustainable. I want to thank Bill Hartung for joining us, as well as Ola Ojewumi, who was in the room yesterday, and Professor Kelly Lytle Hernandez from Los Angeles at UCLA. I'm Amy Goodman. This is Democracy Now! Thanks so much for joining us.